And I'm so inspired to be with all of you. I think what you're doing in Philadelphia is really going to be a model for other cities. And so I actually wish the evening was one where I was hearing from you all in terms of what you're doing. But thank you for inviting me to share. I'm going to put on a PowerPoint so I can keep on track. Let's see. Do you see it?
Yes.
Okay. Well, um, this book recently came out, and it was the result of a really long process on my part to make American history not something that I really had studied at a distance, but to really see more intimately how my own family, my own ancestors were connected, in particular to chattel slavery. And uh, I'm going to share a couple of quotes first um, that have guided me. And one is from Aurora Levins Morales. She's riffing on the word racism, but she's using the Spanish version of from raíces or roots, is the practice of rooting ourselves in the real concrete histories of our people, our families, our local communities, our ethnic communities. It's a radical genealogy, history made personal. It's a keeping of accounts. Its intent is to pierce the immense, mind-deadening denial that permeates daily life, that drowns our deepest grief and horror about the founding and ongoing atrocities of racism, class, and patriarchy in endless chatter about trivialities. Racism or rootedness, she says, is the choice to bear witness to our specific contradictory historical identities in relation to one another. It's an accounting of the debts and assets we've inherited, and acknowledging the precise nature of that inheritance is an act of spiritual and political integrity. I had that quote up every day as I worked on this project. Victory does point me in the direction that I wanted to go. And another person, of course, that I'm sure you've read is Ta-Nehisi Coates. And so we must imagine a new country, reparations, by which I mean the full acceptance of our collective biography and its consequences, is the price we must pay to see ourselves squarely. What is needed is an airing of family secrets, a settling with old ghosts, and what is needed is the healing of the American psyche and the banishment of white guilt. What I'm talking about is a national reckoning that would lead to spiritual rebirth. So where did I come into this conversation? Here I'm juxtaposing the mansion of my great-grandfather in Memphis, Tennessee, whom I'll be talking about later, with the house that my parents bought on Long Island in a Levittown development in 1953. And this is the house I grew up in. It's a little larger than the one it's been added on to since then. But my family, both sides of my family came from Memphis, Tennessee. And you can see they were trying to replicate that history, even in New York. Very odd. Um, and so I grew up in a kind of bicultural um, arrangement where uh, I was I was getting taught about race and prejudice from very, very Southern relatives, and at the same time was in the public school system in New York and learning that what I was being taught at home was not correct history and was a history to be questioned. Um, and so when I finally initially when I embarked on this effort to trace my family's roots, I turned to my mother's family that from whom I had experienced a lot of racism in the way that they talked about people and what they were trying to teach me when I was growing up. And I assumed that that meant that if we went back far enough, we would find that our ancestors had been enslaving people. But actually, that's not what I first discovered. What I first discovered was that they came into the South after the Civil War. And so I started on my father's side, which I hadn't really thought much about at all, and was amazed to find that his and our family went back to 1608 Jamestown. And that was odd because I had never heard about any generation beyond my great-grandparents. I had no idea when they came, where they went, what they did. Um, and as I slowly worked backwards, I saw that they had migrated from colonial Virginia to northern North Carolina to western Tennessee, and then with business interests in the Mississippi Delta. At first, as I was doing the research, I really didn't know what would come out of it. But I began to see that a method was slowly evolving. And that was as I was moving from 1608 Jamestown, um, my thoughts were trying to figure out the context that my ancestor in that particular case had lived in. Of course, you couldn't find out very much about that particular person, but I could find out a lot about what was going on around him and some of the things that he contributed to. And so I began to try to um, crystallize what were the things I was really learning from this history that I thought other people who were racialized as white might not know. And I'll share with you a few of those stories tonight. Um, but you can see in the first part of the book, uh, I'm I'm going across time and across place. So the book moves from 1608 to the present, and it moves from the original site where they came to the colonies to the present. The first part I want to share with you was about what I discovered in 1600s, um, the Virginia colony. As you know, it was created to be a it was a corporation that came. They were seeking wealth. They were seeking a path um, west, and when they came, they understood themselves as British and as Christian. And slowly, throughout that first 100 years, they began to create what we now call whiteness. When they first came, they were not thinking of themselves as white. And as you know, in 1619, the first group of enslaved Africans came from Gambia. They were bought by Governor Yardley in exchange for food and supplies. And from the beginning, although there was some attempt to see them as indentured servants, they were not treated like indentured servants. Indentured servants had a contract. It had their name on it. It had when they arrived, when their indenturement would be over, and there was often a promise of some land grant at that point that they would have to start their own farms. But this wasn't the case for the Africans who arrived. Those who were freed, and there were not many who were, served longer than normal terms of indenture. They were listed as commodities on rosters. They either had no name on these rosters or just their first name. There was no date about when they arrived or when they would be finished with indenturement. And if they were uh, punished for different infractions, one of the punishments they were given was indenturement for life. Um, in 1643, African women were made tithable, which meant that they were put into a category along with livestock and property. When when the English ran away and tried to join with Native American groups, in this case, the Powhatans, they were allowed to stay. But if Africans were able to escape and live with the Powhatans, they were returned to servitude. And gradually, there were many enslaved people who were imported from Barbados and other parts of the Caribbean into the Virginia colony. And at this point, there was a problem because the British Christians understood that they were not supposed to, according to their religious beliefs, they were not supposed to enslave other Christians. So they had a problem because many of the enslaved people who were being um, trafficked into Virginia had already been Christianized. And so gradually, in the later part of the 1600s, you see the beginning of the word white come into conversation, into legislation, and into really fixing an altogether new way of separating people into a hierarchy with so-called white people, regardless of the shades of their skin, being at the top of the hierarchy, and the Africans. And this story, I think, is incredibly important because we need to continue to remind ourselves that being white is really a fantasy. And it's a fantasy and a construct that was created in order to preserve slavery and to create the great wealth that came out of kidnapping people and stealing their labor for generation after generation after generation. So that's one story I want to say. And the next story, I'll skip over the Quaker story because it is available now. But it was my attempt to really show that if we, even if we don't do what's called radical or reparative genealogy with respect to our own families, if we take any of our faith communities, the colleges we may have gone to, the neighborhoods that we grew up in, and we really look into the history, we'll find white supremacy laced throughout it. And I didn't think that this was the case with Quakers. I was sent to a Quaker high school, and the history I was told was that Quakers were abolitionists. And so when I followed James Watkins, who had helped John Smith chart the Chesapeake, his grandchildren became Quakers in colonial Virginia. And then I looked a little deeper and found that they were enslavers, and that I also had Quaker ancestors in Barbados. And they too, along with most of the Quakers in Barbados in the 1600s, were involved in slave trafficking and enslaving. And so, I think we could approach this kind of honest look at who we are, either by starting in the present and working backwards in terms of the groups that we're part of, or in our own families. In northern North Carolina, to a part of Granville County that was really saturated with slavery, much more than many of the other parts of North Carolina. This was in the 1700s. And I began to read all the slave narratives I could get my hands on from North Carolina, and also read the Works Progress Administration's interviews that they did during the New Deal with people who had been enslaved and who obviously were freed after emancipation. But to get their recollections, many of them were children, about what slavery had been like for them and their parents. And from these, I tried to distill how did these people who were enslaved, how did they see the white people who were enslaving them and the other white people that they came into contact with? And my aim there was to try to build a sense of double consciousness for whites. Du Bois and others talk about Black people having had to develop a double consciousness to see themselves through the eyes of white people in order to protect themselves. But oftentimes, white people go about their business without really deeply inquiring, how are they seen by the people who have been at the brunt of the way that they're living their lives. And this exploration, which actually took me a really long time, led to my trying to describe the pathologies that they saw amongst white families, white people. The first thing that struck me was the way that they described dehumanization. And I'll read a short portion from my book. The slave narratives amply describe how dehumanization was a foundational cornerstone of slavery in the colonies. For the settlers to construct those they enslaved as non-human beings opened the door to treating them literally, and I say literally, as animals, feeding them coarse food from animal troughs, denying them adequate shelter and clothing, raping women for breeding purposes, restricting their movements, seeing their labor as not for themselves, but for their, quote, owners, and controlling and disciplining them through violence and terror. Once dehumanized in the eyes of white people, the enslavers literally branded, corralled, chained, bred, coddled, sold, and, quote, managed the enslaved through means of brute force. Slaves were seen as just another beast of burden. As Sarah Alson, a North Carolina enslaver, wrote to her young grandson, for whom she had a carriage built, quote, I reckon it will take all your little waiting men to pull it unless you hitch the old gray, referring to the young African boys that were assigned to his to help him in any way he wished. Sometimes for the purpose of punishment and humiliation, an enslaved person would be substituted for a horse or mule to pull a wagon or carriage. And this dehumanization came up countless times in the ways that the enslaved people talked about those who were owning them. The second pathology that was described over and over again was what we might now these days call pathological narcissism. Narcissists also elevate themselves by suppressing and minimizing the achievements of others. Enslavers tried to keep those they enslaved as ignorant and uneducated as possible. In doing so, they more easily deemed themselves more innately intelligent than Africans. Blount Baker described how the enslaved would be whipped if found with a book. Some enslavers cut off a finger if they found an enslaved trying to learn to write. The enslaver attempted to reduce the other by denying them opportunities to succeed. He then blamed them for seeming less than, claiming it as an internal trait rather than the result of one's own perverse, deprivatory, and exploitative treatment. The narcissist sees himself and his needs and desires at the center of every scene, profoundly blinded to what extrudes into his peripheral vision. And I'm trying in writing about these to track how these pathologies still exist in ourselves, in our families. I certainly experienced it in my own. And although we would like to think that women and children, white women and children, didn't take part in this kind of dehumanization, we would be wrong. And I'm drawing here from a book by Stephanie Jones Rogers. They were her property, white women as slave owners in the American South. Women studied slave management and they came to their own conclusions about how they would treat those they enslaved. Given their own feelings of marginalization, it's not surprising that the slave narratives report that many female enslavers treated those they enslaved with remarkable violence and profound indifference to their feelings and well-being. Harriet Jacobs describes her enslaver mistress, quote, Mrs. Flint, like many Southern women, was totally deficient in energy. She had not strength to superintend her household affairs, but her nerves were so strong she could sit in her easy chair and see a woman whipped till the blood trickled from every stroke of the lash. Parker Poole from near Garner, North Carolina, thought her female enslaver whipped her just to show off. Quote, my masters never did hit me. Mrs. didn't whip me much. She just wanted to show off sometimes. And unfortunately, the white women passed along their attempts to enact, quote, slave management to their children. Jones Rogers describes the little girl Lizzie Anna Burwell from the Lounsville area in North Carolina, quote, she loved flowers and often strolled through her parents' garden with Fanny, the enslaved woman charged with her care. After spending so much time with Fanny, Lizzie Anna developed an intense bond with her. But one day Lizzie Anna became vexed with Fanny, so she went to her father and demanded that he cut Fanny's ears off and get her, Lizzie Anna, a quote, a new maid from Clarksville. Lizzie Anna was 3 years old. Imagine that, 3 years old. So you have to imagine what she's seen in her family already, that she would say such a thing and think such a thing. During those walks through the garden, and perhaps while observing her parents interact with the enslaved people around them, Lizzie Anna was learning how to be a slave owner. She was coming to understand the obscene logic that made it perfectly acceptable to enjoy the company of her enslaved caretaker in one moment and threaten to mutilate her or buy another slave to take her place the next. In the comfort of her home, she was recognizing that she possessed the power to command others to do as she wished. Lizzie Anna, I say, was being comfortable with becoming imperious, possessing, says Jones Roger, the power to command others. While traveling through the South, Frederick Law Olmsted, the architect of Central Park, witnessed a similar incident in the home of a man who enslaved many people. He said, we heard the planter's 8-year-old son whipping his puppy behind the house. I've got an account to settle with you, the boy shouted as he berated his little puppy. I've let you go about long enough. I'll teach you who's your master. His father reprimanded him for cussing. The boy defended himself by saying he was cussing exactly as his father did when he was upset. These are just little snippets to share the kinds of things that I was finding. And, you know, one of the very brutal things was sadism itself and the pleasure that many white people took in punishing and torturing Black people just for the pleasure of it. Martha Organ and her mother were enslaved by Mr. and Mrs. Rufus Jones of Cary, North Carolina. Miss Organ's mother shared with her a chilling account of such sadism. Quote, Alice had been going to the Mrs. house to warm up, so when she went into the woman's house to warm herself, the woman made her stand in front of the fire until her legs burned so badly that the skin cracked and some of it dropped off. The place was a hell on earth. Mother said if there ever could be one, it was hell. Mrs. had slaves whipped for almost any little thing, and then she wouldn't allow them much to eat. My mother told me all about it after the surrender. She said Mrs. ran the plantation and made it hard for all the slaves. She just liked to see slaves beaten almost to death. This, this kind of behavior toward others resulted in a remarkably strong sense of paranoia. As we know, enslavers were vexed by fear of rebellion, as in fact, there was a great desire for resistance and rebellion. A pernicious aspect of fearing retaliation for one's own cruelty is that one can never feel truly safe. Paranoia sets in to make ordinary events signs of what one is afraid of. Lila Nichols describes the kind of harm that could befall someone who's falsely suspected of trying to harm one of their enslavers. And she said, once Mrs. was sick and a slave girl named Alice brought her some water and something to eat. Mrs. got sick to her stomach, and she said Alice had tried to poison her. To show you how sick she was, she got out of bed, stripped that girl to the waist, and whipped her with a cowhide until the blood ran down her back. The girl's back was cut in gashes, and the blood ran to her heels. After that, she was chained by her arms and legs until she got well, and then she was carried off to Richmond in chains and sold. The last pathology I want to address is what Eric Fromm, the psychoanalyst, called necrophilia. And he saw it as at the heart of authoritarian character, which I think is incredibly pertinent to what we're experiencing today. He describes some of the components of an authoritarian character. They'll now sound familiar to us. Those with an authoritarian character have, quote, an intense desire to control, hurt, and humiliate. They're excessively narcissistic, preoccupied with their own thoughts, feelings, and needs. Authoritarians are malignantly aggressive and revengefully destructive. They exhibit conspicuous consumption to fill a sense of an empty self. Authoritarians prefer rigid social hierarchies and place their own group in a superior position, devaluing and often dehumanizing others. They conform to and obey oppressive regimes without deeply questioning them and look down on and attempt to punish those who attempt to deviate, resist, and disobey. And I think we can draw a straight line from the kind of necrophilia that was being enjoyed during the time of slavery by white enslavers and other white people, to the kinds of things that we hear now, as when Trump says he can go into the middle of Times Square and kill somebody and nobody would hold him accountable. The kind of pleasure in destroying structures that have been carefully built up by generations of Americans, and etc. So these were this was an interesting period of my trying to connect the way that white people were seen during the time of slavery to the pathologies that I observed in my own family and in families around myself after, obviously, many years after the end of slavery. And it turned my attention to looking at, well, yes, we need to have reparations for slavery, but there's also the need for reparations for what happened after slavery, which was in some ways even worse for many people, as convict labor was put into place in the South. And the difference really between convict labor and slavery was that, the police, the authorities would round up people they would charge with vagrancy and minor offenses to white people, like not stepping off the curb if a white person came by them. They would round up these people at times of harvest and imprison them, and then have white people come and pay their fine, but then have claim to their labor for a specified period of time. It didn't matter to the people who had paid their fines whether these people lived long lives or not, because they were not a financial investment for them. So these convict laborers were often worked to death and had a lifespan of about 7 years after they were put into labor. And I studied this in particular because of my great grandfather, and I'll try to go to that part if I can get there. So my great grandfather came into Memphis after the end of the Civil War, and as many Northerners, they were able to make a great deal of money by investing in situations where white people, white Southerners, needed investment in order to continue on in their lives. And my great grandfather decided that his means of approach would be to create a lumber company, the Darnell Lumber Company. And unfortunately, that meant creating railway spurs that went into the great Mississippi Delta forest and clear cutting, building labor camps filled with convict labor and other black labor and some white labor, and clear cutting the environment. This was a book I found in the University of Memphis Library. It was a book in memory of my great grandfather, and it contained these pictures of the men who worked for him cutting down these massive trees. You can see at the bottom there a small man and the sort of great growth forest that was around him that was completely cut down. This was a picture by Dorothea Lange of what happened in Mississippi. And unfortunately, the cutting down of, we're talking about millions of trees. On the one, incredible amount of wealth. He built that mansion that you saw. But it also contributed to the Great Flood of 1927 in the Mississippi Delta, which may or may not be one that you're aware of, but was one of the worst environmental disasters in the United States because the trees had been cut down and other factors as well. When the water came down the Mississippi River, it inundated, hundreds and hundreds of miles of land. Black people were ordered to get up onto I forget what the name of it is, that the areas where they would try to put the sandbags to minimize the flooding, and hundreds of African Americans were swept away into the water. After the flood, they were commanded to go on to these strips of land and to live there and to be working there without pay, while the white people were taken on boats and barges out of the area until the water subsided. This is just one of the stories. And I went to that area of Mississippi that my great grandfather had a lot to do in decimating. And this is what I found on one patch of his land. And unfortunately, in visiting the various areas where my family had plantations and enslaved people, this is what happened to the environment. So it was really like a dual exploitation of Black labor and a kind of enslaving of the environment as well. So before I get to Kelly House, I want to go back. Hold on. One of the stories that I found, I was looking at, well, what was it like 100 years after the end of slavery? And that took me to where my family was living at the end of slavery was a little bit east of Memphis, in Somerville and LaGrange in Fayette County, Memphis. And 100 years later, I learned about the story of one of the longest struggles to gain voting rights in the United States. It's a story that I don't think is known well enough as one of the first civil rights struggles right in Fayette County. And I bring it up because, of course, I knew about the struggle for voting rights. But again, I knew it in this abstract without finding a kind of immediate relationship to my family and really looking into the details. I had no idea. I mean, I was in what's called white innocence with regard to what people went through when they went to vote. So what happened in Fayette County was there was a Black lawyer named Estes who was telling the people that the African Americans there that they needed to be able to register to vote, and because otherwise they weren't able to sit on juries, and their people were really suffering because of this. And so people began to try to go to vote, and when they would go to the courthouse to do that, they would find it closed. Or they would find the only hour to do it was an hour when everybody had to be at work. Or they would find that, oh, the room where it usually was, it was no longer there. They had to go down to the basement into very scary parts of the courthouse to try to find the person to sign up to vote. But that was just the beginning of their problems. They found that once they did vote, that a list was being kept amongst the white people of who had signed up to vote. And immediately, the employers of those people let them go from their jobs. If they were sharecroppers and were living on white people's land, they were immediately told to leave with their families, even if their families had been living and working there for generations. And that was just the beginning. If they needed to buy groceries or buy milk for their babies, no white storekeeper in the county or the surrounding county would sell it to them. They couldn't get gasoline for their cars. Their cars, and if they had any machinery to do farming on their own, was all confiscated. And so gradually, an African American man who owned some land and an African American woman the same gave their land so that tents could be put up and people would have a place to live. And sadly, the people experienced that the tents, as muddy as they were in the winter and as cold as they were actually superior to the living conditions that they had been living in, but they were not safe. Groups of white people would drive by in cars and shoot into the tents at night. They would threaten the leaders of the movement, beat them up, even force the mothers of the leaders off the road at night, really creating an atmosphere of terror for these people. And when the struggle began to yield some results in terms of the number of people voting, the white people found other ways to interfere with the election process so that Black votes didn't count, something we're still struggling with now in the matter of redistricting. When people couldn't go back to their old jobs, there were not jobs opened to them. White people, even if it wasn't financially advantageous for them, went all out in mechanizing their farms so that they would not hire Black people back. And gradually you see that African Americans living in those counties slowly left until the town that my ancestors lived in, LaGrange. I think now it has 126 people, and not a single one of them are Black. So just checking the time here. I want to say briefly that, from the beginnings of slavery, really there were many attempts to call for reparations. And this is so important to what you all are doing now in Philadelphia, because the calls for reparations ended up in a great deal of harm and misfortune falling on the people who led those movements and who actually continue to lead those movements. And I'll give you one example of Callie House. Let's see. So there was an organization in the late 1800s called the National Ex-Slave Mutual Relief, Bounty, and Pension Association, and was formed by a man named Isaiah Dickerson. And after he finished his leadership, he turned it over to Callie House, a laundress from Nashville, who was herself born into slavery, and she was very concerned about older African Americans who had been slaves, who were suffering from great physical hardship and had very little money, if any. She thought that the United States government should use the taxes that they had gained from crops, cotton taxes, at the end of the Civil War, to fund pensions for these people. And so she went about the country very tirelessly collecting signatures, collecting 300,000 signatures to support a bill to create pensions. And she was rallying 600,000 members to this organization. And the more members she rallied, the more the government began to surveil and harass her. They began to malign her as though she were trying to profiteer from her own people, that she was trying to deceive them by collecting small membership dues. These membership dues were actually being used to help pay doctors' bills, to help people with burial expenses for their elders. There's no proof in any way that she profited from the work that she did. And this is all in a book by Mary Frances Berry called My Face is Black is True, Callie House and the Struggle for Ex-Slave Reparations. She was that the post office claimed that she was committing postal fraud, and they no longer allowed her to use the mail system. They wouldn't allow her to have cash money orders. And so this was really an attempt to completely disable the organization and made her work even harder to continue on. But when she pressed the government, they claimed immunity. And then, sadly, the Supreme Court supported them. She was arrested in 1916 for mail fraud by an all-male, all-white jury, and they fined her $1,000. Well, Callie House didn't have $1,000, so she was placed in prison. And if you follow the history of reparations from that point, Queen Mother Audley Moore onwards, you'll find that the federal government has done everything it can to not accept accountability for having given reparations to slaveholders, not enslavers, but having criminalized the people asking for very justifiable accountability on the part of government. Um, so, our path as people trying to form solidarity with Black-led reparations movements means that we have to um, really pull apart this circle here that keeps the gate to the commons locked and perpetuates inequality. And I describe it as, people who have inherited wealth, land, or social or political, racial privilege and power. Not everybody has inherited wealth, but we have inherited racial privilege and power. Um, and oftentimes there's an indoctrination into ideologies that sustain privileges like radical individualism and capitalism, voracious capitalism. We try to get our kids elite education for heightened economic success on their part and social status. Um, we and they then have the ability to secure loans, to buy or maintain land, to make capital accruing investments from higher salary and inherited wealth, and can then launch children and grandchildren into these ideologies and educational and social privileges that help them sustain and accumulate capital. So how do we interrupt this and stop it? Um, you know, I'm sure you each have a really fascinating story about how you stepped on to a path of repair. And I know one of the things that was really bothering me was that while I was working full time as a college professor, not making a lot of money, but actually quite adequate, um, I was making more money by my house gaining value and more money by my 401k gaining value, so that my wealth was accruing not by virtue of my own labors, but by virtue of the fact that I had some money to put into the capitalist game. And I felt very creepy about that was completely unfair because so many African Americans have been completely thwarted from gaining those kinds of nest eggs, whether it be in property or savings that can help them gain some financial security. So, regardless of what the disturbing thoughts, feelings, or interactions that you've had, that the secret is turning toward them with curiosity and openness rather than with denial and defensiveness, and allowing that curiosity and openness to help us move toward forging a commitment to explore our ancestors and our own roles in the kind of injustice that we're living in. And that leads to these tasks of recovering historical memory that I've been talking about, of de-ideologizing cultural assumptions like individualism, the idea of whiteness itself, etc., and beginning to imagine, what would it be like if we as people racialized as white could finally extricate ourselves from racial hierarchy. This involves an honest accounting. And for me, it was really important to discover the extent of the harm, the particularity of the harm, the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people that my ancestors, whether it be 8 people at a time, 22 people at a time, 50 people at a time, that they enslaved and brutally abused. And when you do that kind of inventory, that kind of acknowledgement of harms, I think it's quite natural that you open yourself to feelings of shame and collective remorse. And whereas some would argue that white people should get over shame, I actually believe that this kind of collective shame can really be an impetus to trying to live into greater integrity, where the kinds of things that disturb us that we know are wrong are things that we're willing to begin to really use our energies and our lives to redress. And it also means acknowledging that to a certain degree, white people have accumulated a lot of spiritual poverty alongside all this excess of status and resources. So I'm imagining that you're in this part of the circle where you have a commitment to the non-repeat of harm. You're breaking the cycle of excess intergenerational wealth transfer and resolving to return excess wealth, land, and power to the common good. And that then leads you to the important step of co-creating a plan for return and accountability and beginning on divestiture, whether it's in your private life or in your community life, in a church or in a neighborhood, a town, a city. And then to strengthen engagement in practices of what we call mutual accompaniment, mutual aid, and solidarity. And these are some of the groups that I was part of that meant a lot to me as I went through this. And I can only say that being a part of them was completely crucial to my being able to sustain the work and to be accountable to the work. And so I'm so happy to see you all here giving yourselves, sustenance and encouragement. So as I went through the South, I visited all these places and I was looking for, as I divest, what can I help support? And that search was a long search, but I discovered a community in Jackson, Mississippi called the Cooperative Community of New West Jackson, where a group of African Americans had bought up 65 abandoned buildings of homes, as like the one you see here, in an 8-block community that was really in a state of high poverty and blight. And they began to use a cooperative model to see what neighbors' talents were, to begin to build cooperatives so that they could begin to address generational poverty, systemic exclusion, and years of misguided charity work. This is from their website. And they would take these kinds of houses and turn them into this kind of a house. A few of these are Airbnbs where people can go and visit and learn about what they're trying to do there. And I found that it was an incredible visionary process of Black placemaking that doesn't want to be dependent on white donors, wants to build to the point of being self-generative and self-supporting, but which at this point really needed resources. So that's where I'm going to end. If you use this little code, you can get 20% off my book. And now I'm going to stop sharing and stop talking and see what you all have to say. Thank you.
Wow, thanks. Thank you so much, Mary. Yeah, so would love to hear questions or thoughts or anything you'd like to responses to what you've heard. And thank you, gosh, so much for you covered so much ground.
It's hard when you've spent so many years writing a book to figure out what you're going to say, but I hope it helps in some way. And please do tell me what you're thinking.
Hi, Mary. My name is Jim Christopher, and
Hi.
thank you so much for coming and sharing such amazing just history and some of it personal history, your own family going back, but just some of those things. It's gut-wrenching to listen to some of those stories. Little 3-year-old girls talking about cutting off somebody's ears because
Yes.
the hubris of that, or just but the pathology of it. I really like the way you described that, because it's a pathology that not only existed then, but of course that we still carry with us, that has been kind of infused into the whole mythology, and the pathology of like the America. The part that really resonated for me, that really jumped out, was when you were talking about Jamestown and Virginia and the colonists there, and that period between 1608, 1619, and then going forward. How you mentioned that part about how there was this sort of a quandary, like whatever you want to call it, like a cognitive dissonance or something, where they're like, well, we can't, we can't enslave other Christians, and then how that rationale that came about, however it came about, this idea of, oh well, defining them as a different type of a person and really
Yes.
less than a person, of course, eventually became, ingrained 3/5 of a person later. But it's like, that's just that idea that we could somehow create this break in the human race, or this, and how that, and really in a way, it's something that I think and it just really struck me, because I'm like, wow, so it was really a rationalization to be a good Christian. And it's how this stuff is all wound together. It's kind of this Byzantine, this Gordian knot of insanity and pathology that we are all part of in this country. And just really, there's a lot there to unpack, and I just want to really thank you for sharing that. And it makes me want to maybe learn more, but also maybe sit with it more and feel more about what that really has meant and means, to me and to the people, in this, that I share this place with, this world we live in.
Yeah, I think you put that very well. Like, how do I be a good Christian while continuing to amass a great fortune using stolen labor? And so whiteness was invented. It had a purpose, and it was completely connected with racial hierarchy. So now, we're white. We can't say we're not white. Our ancestors created it. This is the way it is. It doesn't make any sense. But our work is a lot like the work of, I think, that the Germans had to do after the Second World War, where they needed to tease apart anti-Semitism from being German. We need to tease apart racial hierarchy and hierarchizing people in general from whiteness. And if we could do that, if we could do it, our ancestors would have a very different history to tell. They could talk about this great mistake that was made and how people actually worked over time to undo it. But we are not there now. We are far short of that now. Thank you. Yes, this part really it really affected me. I didn't know it. I was unaware. What else? Please talk to me. Pretty please. Ruth, are you talking?
No, we're
Okay.
trying to unmute.
Yeah.
We were trying to remember the title of the book that we did read through from Prague on
Christian something.
Christian reparations for Christian. Okay. Anyway, in the book, there is much of what you said, and some ideas for ways to look at what reparations are. But there's an introduction to the book that is a letter from a former enslaved person who's
Get a little closer to the mic.
a letter from a formerly enslaved person whose former owner asked him to come back and work for him after the Civil War. And he said, and he wanted to pay him almost nothing. And the letter was written by the former enslaved person, saying, oh, I'll come back if you do this and this and this and this. And of course it was, I will do this work for you and you will pay me at this rate and you will pay me for the past work that I've done for you that you're asking me to do now for pay. And it was an absolutely wonderful, wonderful letter. And then it went into how Christians can look at reparations. But we've just finished a course called "What You Never Learned in School,"
I like
and
it.
and it was pretty much exactly what you say. And so I'm wondering really how we get these stories to the public that doesn't have any interest in even knowing the truth. And so I'm asking you, how is your book selling? Who's buying? Is anyone using it to teach in universities?
We
Um, it's
well, my
you can hear
book
my
just
dog.
came
That's
out
the problem. Okay, so
last month, but at the end of each chapter, that's okay. At the end of each chapter, I have a study guide for people who are using this as a group, questions that they can use to explore their own family genealogies and their own relationship to things like these pathologies, their own efforts to be accountable. So it will be used by groups, but in terms of all of us, I mean, we each have families and friends, and what I find amongst the white people I know is that our family have the same history. So I think we all need to be active in telling these stories, whether it's through an op-ed at a family dinner, in a letter to a nephew, in as many ways as we can, because right now we're in a period where history is being erased. And we need to know our history, hang on to our history, talk about our history until we reach a better time in the country, where there's a more concerted federal level to be truthful about, the sins of our country, and not just during slavery, but since slavery as well, during Jim Crow and since then. So thank you. I agree with it. And it sounds like a really good curricula that you're following in your church. Please. Yes, David.
Yeah, I'm David Tatkenhorst. I'm in West Philadelphia, and I want to thank you for this amazing work. I think what you've done is, I mean, after tonight, this should be a bestseller.
That's so sweet. The proceeds are going to the community I shared with you, the New West Jackson. So
That's
I hope it will
fantastic.
be.
I'd like you to, if you could, put back up the slide that gives the information about purchasing the book, and because maybe could get it that way instead of through Amazon. Um, and I,
Can you see it?
yeah,
Okay. That's
that's
through the
helpful.
publisher.
Right. Thank you.
Yeah.
And my question, the question I have for you is, what has it done for you personally to be able to do this work?
Mhm.
How has it enriched you
Yeah, I love that
to be
question,
doing this work?
because we're also healing ourselves, right, as white
Exactly.
people. And um I felt very rootless. Everybody in my family from the South grew up in New York, moved to Boston, moved to Pittsburgh, moved to Zurich, moved to Boston, moved to California.
Yeah.
I had no relationship to these places where my ancestors had lived. I'd never been to Mississippi. I'd never been to that part of North Carolina or Virginia. And so visiting and learning um, gave me a sense of rootedness. That was the word we started out with from Aurora Levins Morales, and of a greater belonging. You know, when people think about divesting, sometimes they initially think of it as, owning less. What they don't think of is the kind of joy of helping something grow that moves the world toward the way you would rather it be, right? It's a sort of a utopian thing. I call it prophetic imagination, where uh, for instance, I really believe in cooperatives as a form of organization for people so that profits can be shared and there can be mutual aid and support. And so to find out that there were these African principles of economics that were brought with Africans that still inspire um, some of their efforts at cooperatism was really exciting for me, and it really felt like something I wanted to support in whatever way I could. So those are two things, and then I think forming relationships with other white people who are dealing with the pathologies that they've inherited, the excess that they may have inherited, but certainly the excess privilege and really false privilege has been a beautiful set of communities in which to be challenged and to be supported, and to see people. Like I got to know many young people working with an organization called Resource Generation, that these young people who are 20 and 30 who have inherited like way far more money than I've ever heard of, who are giving it all away. They understand that they will feel lighter, that they will feel less encumbered and more like a neighbor if they don't live their whole life with the burden of excess, given the history of how it was accrued, not all necessarily having to do with slavery, some with the pharmaceutical industry or the timber industry, etc. So yes, I suffered racial shame, collective remorse, etc. But I feel so much better. So I think we're all on the right path. Thank you. We have a few more minutes. Who's going to jump in?
I'd like to see again the last set of slides about the process of moving into reparations and how it flows along.
Sure. Let's see.
Let's
see. This one?
Yeah, that's one of them. Because you had 3 or 4 of them.
Yeah, you want to see all of them?
Please, and
okay.
I don't know if we could receive them.
Yes, of course, and they're in the book too. Yes, of course you can receive them. I can give them to Lucy. Yeah,
okay,
and these are based on an article I wrote, a pedagogy for the non-poor. Maybe I'll send that article to Lucy, and you can see the context.
Yes,
of
thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, let's just quickly go through them again.
Oh, you want to go through them? Okay.
No, that's all right. If you're going to send them.
Okay.
Somebody else get in.
I called it a pedagogy for the non-poor, building on Paulo Freire's work, those of you who may know his work from Brazil, because he was primarily looking at what's called a pedagogy of the oppressed. But the pedagogy for the non-poor uses those first few things I mentioned, let's see if I can get there again. Hold on. These three, can blow it up a little bit, are all
Yeah.
are all from the pedagogy of the oppressed, but it's different, for us. It's both similar and different. So these are like liberatory tasks that really connect us with the pedagogy of the oppressed. And then I think these begin to differentiate what our work is. And, I call it white work because it has to do with the fact that, we were born into this racialized category. We didn't choose it. We can't lay it down, but we can certainly understand where it came from, what it does to us, and how we need to transform it. Stop sharing.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I really love all that and the thinking behind it. And I also like it's interesting because I think there's the naming of the pathology, the depth of the pathology of whiteness is like way too rare, I think. I mean, clear, it's really clear. But I think the other thing is that and you kind of touch on it, that it impacts the sort of dehumanization that we enact on others, but it also shows up in how white people treat other white people and how like we treat each other in families too. I mean, like there's a disconnection that doesn't just extend to the people whom we've actively dehumanized and categorized, but it also there's so much that happens inside of white families as well that makes it perpetuate. And so it's like, so that like there's just so many reasons for us to work for this healing. It feels like to be whole with each other, to be whole across racial lines, to be whole with our own selves as well.
Yeah, it reminds me of what Césaire said about World War II and the Holocaust, that all the things that had happened in the history of colonialism that Europeans enacted on people of color bled back into Europe and then resulted in this war and the Holocaust. So, I mean, we would like to think that if a little girl who wants to cut off ears grows up, that her abusive behavior is just toward that particular group. But how can it be completely separated from how she treats her sisters and her own child and her and herself? And so I think Baldwin said, you can't dehumanize others without dehumanizing yourself. So once you dehumanize others, this part he didn't say, you're doing things to them that make you, a very brutal, self-serving person. Yeah. So we have this problem in our families, how to see that some of what we're suffering actually has this long arc from slavery. And I can tell you in my own family, before my mother died, she had paranoia that she was living in Florida, that Cubans were going to come through the vents in her ceiling. This was directly out of slavery. This was directly from her family, the kind of paranoia that they had had over generations about people of color, that had never been worked through because they were still all involved in white supremacy.
Right.
Well, thank you.
And the double consciousness that lets people live in two contradictory worlds simultaneously.
Yes, double
And it
consciousness.
provides a total barrier between to understanding.
Yes.
It helps explain the whole radical right. Well, not
Yes.
so radical anymore, but
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, we're still in this terrible moment in our history. There is so much from our past that has come
Yeah.
right along and is in full view now. It's we certainly did not heal from the Civil War.
No.
Or from slavery. So
Max had it right. The chickens are coming home to roost.
Yes.
Mhm.
so it's 8:31, and I'd love for us to do a little checkout, just a one-word checkout. And mine is I don't know, contemplative. And I'm gonna pass it to Lisa.
Reflective. Pass to Melanie.
Grounded. Now I will pass to iPad 6. I'm sorry, I forgot your name. Sorry, the gentleman who is with the iPad.
Willie, Willie.
It's Willie.
Willie, thank you. I should have written it down. Sorry.
Willie, very uneasy.
Will you
Jim,
Just sitting with the shame. David Tattenhorst.
Ready to do the work. I will pick Paige.
Many mixed emotions. Grateful for the extra knowledge and devastated to hear it. Ruth and Barbara?
Thankful to Mary, but encouraged to keep working at this.
Needing to sit with it. We're passing it to who? Meg? Have you done one? I don't.
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you. I feel heavy and angry, which is rare for me. Ken?
Ken, you're muted.
Strengthened.
Do you want to pass it to somebody? I think Aunt and Mary have not gone.
Paige.
Oh, no, Paige went.
Melanie.
She went too. I think Aunt and Mary.
I heard Ken say two things, meaning one. I'll say both of them: stricken and strengthened.
Oh, Dave. Yeah.
And yeah, Melanie.
She went already. Aunt.
Anthony said.
Aunt. Hey, Aunt.
I think people really want you to go, Mel. Melanie, I think they really want you to go. Again, I'll say, justified is the word I'll use.
And I guess it's you, Mary.
I'm heartened to see you all here and working on this, and I wish we had another hour so I could hear from you what you're doing, but maybe next time. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Everybody.
Thank you, Mary.
Bye-bye.
Yes, thank you, Mary.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Good night, everybody.
Good night.